Before a system collapses, it whispers. It never starts with alarms, sirens, or headlines. It starts with small fractures in places people assume are fine. Places nobody ever expects to become the epicenter of national failure. Minnesota is one of those places. Most Americans hear Minnesota and they picture suburban streets, functioning schools, polite neighborhoods, well-run state agencies, and a government that at least tries. A state that prides itself on being orderly, decent, and predictable. But that's exactly why this story matters. Because when corruption shows up in a place like Minnesota, it means the deeper structural rot is already far more advanced than anyone wants to admit. Collapse never begins where you expect. It begins where you're not looking. And in Minnesota, the warning signs weren't flashing. They were quietly rotting beneath the surface. So let's take a look at the first crack. A government that stopped governing. Minnesota didn't wake up one day and suddenly lose $250 million in taxpayer money to a fraudulent network of shell nonprofits. No, this was years in the making. A breakdown like this only happens when oversight weakens, accountability disappears, agencies stop verifying, public funds become political currency, and the system starts rewarding compliance instead of competence. Minnesota became a case study in what happens when government agencies forget the most basic rule of public service. It's not your money. It's the people's money. But the people didn't fail. The institutions meant to guard their money did. And if you trace the timeline, you see the pattern clearly. Early warnings were ignored. Auditors raised concerns and were dismissed. Internal reviews showed irregularities that were quietly buried. Political leadership protected the narrative instead of the taxpayer. This is not speculation. This comes directly from legislative audits, federal court filings, and the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor, all documenting years of internal dysfunction and procedural negligence. Hundreds of millions of dollars were approved with no proper documentation, no verified receipts, no formal auditing trails, no cross-checking, no meaningful enforcement. This isn't a small bureaucratic mistake. This is a systemic collapse. Because when public agencies stop checking the basics, fraud isn't an accident. Fraud becomes inevitable. And in Minnesota, fraud didn't disappear. It multiplied. The second crack, fraud always follows weakness. A state with strong oversight doesn't attract criminal networks. A state with weak oversight does, every single time. Criminals don't reinvent the wheel. They go where the defense is the softest. And Minnesota was soft. This is why federal prosecutors describing Feeding Our Future scandal as one of the largest pandemic fraud schemes in the United States. Not because criminals were unusually talented, but because the system was unusually vulnerable. The fraud network operated with near impunity because the state didn't verify meal sites, the state didn't verify vendor legitimacy, the state didn't verify food delivery logs. The state accepted documentation at face value. And when internal employees raised red flags, they were ignored or pressured into silence. Think about that. A state known for organization and diligence allowed a network of shell companies to claim they were feeding 5,000 out of a single small property, with no evidence the meals ever existed. They reported fictional meal counts that would have required more children than lived in the surrounding neighborhoods. They billed the government for luxury cars, private homes, and international travel, filed under the guise of feeding kids. And the state paid the invoices. That's not fraud. That's indictment of a system asleep at the wheel. And here's what should concern every American. Fraud does not thrive in strong systems. It thrives in weak ones. And Minnesota's weakness became an open invitation. Criminal networks follow the same formula everywhere. Find the weak agency, then exploit the loopholes. Move money faster than oversight can track. Use complexity as camouflage. And then scale until someone finally notices. Minnesota wasn't targeted because it's Minnesota. Minnesota was targeted because its oversight structure had cracks, and criminals follow cracks the way water follows gravity. The moment the first fraudulent claim was approved without scrutiny, the flood started. And the flood didn't slow because the system didn't push back. Not at first. Not even close. The third crack, when government silences its own watchdogs. The most dangerous stage of state failure isn't when fraud appears. It's when honest employees notice and leadership chooses not to listen. Multiple whistleblowers within Minnesota agencies reported suspicious applications, repeated documentation failures, non-existent addresses, inconsistent meal counts, duplicate vendors, inflated numbers that defied basic math. These weren't vague concerns. They were documented, time-stamped, and escalated to supervisors. And what happened? Supervisors told staff, don't question it. Just process the payment. We don't want political backlash. Stop slowing down the workflow. Some employees reported being reprimanded for pushing too hard. Some were removed from decision-making roles. Some simply stopped reporting irregularities because nothing changed. This is where corruption spreads, not when bad people act, but when good people stop being allowed to respond. And the silence wasn't accidental. It was cultural, it was political, and it became operational. Minnesota didn't just lose the money, it lost control. The fourth crack, where there is money, networks form. The fourth crack, where there is money, networks form. Fraud at scale is never random. It is always organized. Federal investigators uncovered interconnected shell companies, coordinated money laundering patterns, shared vendors between fraudulent sites, cash flowing through the same banking corridors, fraudulent invoices created from identical templates, defendants who bought homes, cars, and luxury goods with taxpayer money. This wasn't a few people taking advantage of the system. This was a network exploiting a state that wasn't paying attention. And the moment criminals realized Minnesota agencies weren't verifying anything, they expanded fast, aggressively, confidently. Because why wouldn't they? The door wasn't just unlocked, it was wide open. That's the real story here. Fraud didn't beat Minnesota. Minnesota surrendered the fight before it even began. If you're still with me, do one thing that actually moves the algorithm. Like this video. It tells YouTube this topic matters. Comment your thoughts down in chat. Even one sentence boosts distribution, and I read every single one. Subscribe to the channel for more breakdowns like this. If section 1 showed Minnesota as the warning sign, then the next section is going to expose the part most people never want to look at. How the system actually failed, and how taxpayers became the collateral damage of a political machine that stopped guarding the public's money. Because fraud on this scale, tens of millions of dollars siphoned through fake nonprofits, shell LLCs, falsified meal counts, and government reimbursements doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't appear out of thin air. It requires permission, whether intentional or through neglect. And Minnesota gave that permission. Not in writing, not in words, but in the way every single safeguard that is supposed to protect the public simply evaporated. This wasn't one agency failure. It was a multi-layer oversight collapse, local, state, and federal, each one passing the responsibility downward until nobody was actually watching the door. And the wolves walked right through it. So let's break down the mechanics, because this is where the betrayal starts. Minnesota's Department of Education oversees the federal child nutrition programs, billions of dollars flowing from USDA into state-approved nonprofits, child care centers, and meal providers. For years, the Inspector General's office warned that these programs nationwide were vulnerable to fraud. Why? Because providers self-report meal totals. Oversight relies heavily on paperwork. Site inspections are limited, rushed, or skipped entirely. States are incentivized to approve more providers, not reject them. Now add Minnesota's internal culture of deference over scrutiny, a political environment where agencies are terrified of appearing discriminatory, punitive, or overly suspicious of nonprofits tied to immigrant communities. And suddenly you have a system where fraud isn't just possible, it's easy. The Feeding Our Future scandal, which federal prosecutors describe as the largest COVID-era fraud case in the US, didn't start with a master criminal empire. It started with loopholes everyone already knew existed. weaponized by people who realized the state wasn't checking. When money moves without verification, abuse follows. When rules aren't enforced, corruption fills the vacuum. And when officials look the other way out of fear or convenience, the public gets robbed. That's what happened here. So let's talk numbers, real numbers. According to DOJ filings, the fraud network claimed to have served 125 million meals, not in a year, in a span so short it should have required feeding entire cities multiple times a week. One site claimed over 5,000 children were being fed daily, in a location that didn't have parking spaces, much less facilities for that volume. Another listed children with names generated from a random website. Federal indictments show spreadsheets where hundreds of names were copied and pasted repeatedly. No oversight caught it. Why? Because Minnesota didn't verify the meal counts. Because the oversight officers rubber-stamped applications. Because internal whistleblowers who raised concerns were dismissed. Because the nonprofit at the center of the scandal sued the state, and the state backed down rather than risk political fallout. That moment when MDE reinstated Feeding Our Future after their lawsuit was the quiet turning point, the signal that the referees had left the field. And once the money started pouring in, the fraud exploded. Pandemic waivers reduced in-person inspections. Paperwork replaced verification. Funding tripled. Oversight disappeared almost entirely. The betrayal wasn't the fraud itself. Fraudsters exist everywhere. The betrayal was the system that allowed them to operate openly, aggressively, and at historic scale while taxpayers footed the bill. This wasn't incompetence. It was ideological blindness mixed with bureaucratic paralysis. Minnesota trusted the wrong people and distrusted accountability, and the taxpayers paid for it. So the FBI enters. When a state can't police itself, the federal government steps in. And that's exactly what happened. By mid-2021, the FBI had already begun investigating Feeding Our Future. Not because the state asked them to, but because banks flagged the suspicious flow of money. Hundreds of millions moving through small nonprofits. Massive transfers to luxury cars, overseas property, jewelry, private accounts. Banks did what governments didn't. They noticed. By early 2022, federal agents executed search warrants on more than a dozen locations. And here's the part that should scare every American. Minnesota officials publicly claimed they were cooperating fully, but the FBI's own filings tell a different story. Agents described MD oversight as minimal, superficial, and in some cases, non-existent. Internal communications showed that state employees had concerns but did not act decisively. Court documents reveal that even after warnings, even after red flags, even after financial anomalies, the approvals kept coming. Imagine watching a house burn in slow motion while the people responsible for the fire alarms argue about whether pulling the lever might look bad. That was Minnesota. And that's why the FBI had no choice but to intervene. When political fear overrides accountability, federal law enforcement becomes the last line of defense. Not because they should be, but because nobody else stepped up. So, the accountability vacuum. Here's the part most Americans don't realize. Oversight didn't fail because people were too stupid. It failed because people were too scared. Scared of backlash, scared of political accusations, scared of targeting vulnerable communities, scared of being labeled as biased. And in that vacuum, corruption thrives. This is a pattern we've seen in failing states. Nigeria, Lebanon, parts of Latin America. When accountability becomes politically radioactive, agencies stop enforcing rules. Minnesota didn't become a corrupt state overnight. It became a complacent one. And complacency is how fraud networks take root and thrive. The reason the FBI stepped in wasn't because of the amount stolen alone. It was because of the systemic collapse. The realization that if the feds didn't intervene, nobody would. This is what happens when political incentives don't align with protecting the taxpayer. Money becomes soft, oversight becomes symbolic, and criminals evolve faster than the government meant to catch them. And Minnesotans, the people who trusted their state, paid the price. If you're following this breakdown so far, hit like so this analysis reaches more people. Subscribe for the next part of this investigation and drop a comment down below with your thoughts. YouTube uses engagement to push this long form, just like this. So let's talk about the cost nobody is talking about. The headline number is shocking. $250 million in fraud, according to federal prosecutors. But the real cost isn't measured in stolen dollars. It's measured in trust, lost. When taxpayers lose trust in government spending, everything becomes harder. Funding schools, supporting real safety nets, maintaining public institutions, building community programs, protecting vulnerable populations. Fraud doesn't just steal money. It steals legitimacy. It steals confidence. It steals the moral authority a government needs to function. Minnesota didn't just lose dollars. It lost credibility. And when credibility collapses, corruption spreads. Because criminals don't just look for opportunity. They look for weakness. And Minnesota showed them one. The FBI didn't indict 70 plus people because Minnesota is special. It did it because Minnesota is a blueprint, a warning, a preview of what happens when money moves fast, oversight moves slow, politics overrides accountability, agencies fear public scrutiny more than fraud, states operate on trust instead of verification. This wasn't one isolated failure. This was a crack in the national foundation. And as federal law enforcement continues to uncover similar cases across the country, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Minnesota wasn't the exception. It was the first place the system broke loudly enough for the nation to hear. When a state collapses in silence, most people shrug and say, that's Minnesota's problem. But that's a big mistake. That's the illusion. Because Minnesota isn't an isolated failure. It's a mirror reflecting what happens when oversight becomes optional, when public money becomes abstract, and when accountability is treated like an outdated idea instead of the backbone of a functioning republic. Minnesota is not the worst state. It's the most visible warning sign for what happens everywhere government grows faster than the mechanisms meant to control it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Minnesota didn't break a system. Minnesota exposed the one that was already broken. You cannot pour billions into emergency programs, waive in-person inspections, fast-track approvals, loosen compliance rules, and then act shocked when fraudsters show up like moths to a floodlight. That isn't Minnesota's quirk. That's human nature. That's what criminals do when governments stop watching. And what happens in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the other surrounding counties is simply the places where the cracks grew too large to ignore. Let's be brutally honest. Oversight didn't die in Minnesota. It atrophied, quietly, gradually, predictably, until it becomes meaningless. That's the part that should shake this entire country. Because oversight doesn't disappear overnight. It deteriorates through a series of decisions that feel reasonable in the moment. We don't want to appear biased. We can't afford delays. We need to increase access, not restrict it. The program is designed to trust providers. We don't have the staff to investigate everything. Every one of those statements has been said in state agencies across America, and each one chips away at accountability. Minnesota's mirror doesn't show corruption alone. It shows the depth of institutional courage, the willingness to enforce rules even when it is politically inconvenient. Because oversight is not glamorous. It doesn't win elections. It doesn't get applause. Real oversight is uncomfortable. It requires telling people no. It requires verifying instead of trusting. It requires audits, site visits, documentation, pushback, confrontation. It requires a backbone. And what Minnesota revealed is what happens when that backbone softens. The pandemic only accelerated what was already in motion. Between 2020 and 2022, federal spending surged to nearly $5 trillion in emergency aid. That's pulled from Treasury and CBO data. With that surge came loosened rules, reduced inspections, and rapid disbursement to avoid delays. Fraud experts warned Congress publicly as early as 2020 that such conditions would create generational levels of fraud. Inspectors generals across multiple federal agencies later estimated at least $280 billion in COVID relief nationwide was either stolen or improperly used, a figure the Government Accountability Office, GAO, stands behind today. Minnesota wasn't an anomaly. It was a case study, a loud one, a cinematic one, a failure so large it forced the public to finally look at something the federal government already knew. When oversight dies, fraud doesn't disappear. It multiplies. And it multiplies fast. Here's where most people miss the real danger. Minnesota is not one scandal. It is a blueprint, a sequence of vulnerabilities that exist in every state. Rapid federal funding with minimal verification. Local agencies overwhelmed or undertrained. Political fear of appearing discriminatory or punitive. Nonprofits exploiting the trust-based model. State regulators hesitant to enforce rules aggressively. Whistleblowers dismissed or downplayed. Banks raising red flags before the government does. Federal agencies forced to clean up state-level failures. This sequence isn't unique to Minnesota. It exists in California, New York, Illinois, Texas, Arizona, Florida. It exists anywhere money moves faster than oversight. Look at unemployment insurance fraud during COVID. The Department of Labor estimates roughly $191 billion in fraudulent claims nationwide. Not Minnesota's fault, not California's fault. A systemic collapse of verification. Look at PPP loan fraud. The DOJ has charged over 3,000 defendants connected to more than $8 billion in stolen relief, with total losses estimated much higher. This, again, comes from the DOJ and SBA OIG data. Look at SNAP, Medicaid, FEMA grants. Each one has documented large-scale fraud cases in multiple states. This isn't a Minnesota story only. This is a national pattern. When government expands faster than its safeguards, the honest get drowned out by the opportunists. And the opportunists are always faster. Why? Because criminals adapt instantly. Government adapts slowly, and the public rarely notices until the headlines explode. Minnesota is simply where the explosion happened loud enough that we couldn't ignore it. But make no mistake, the same vulnerabilities exist everywhere. Let's debunk the myth of one bad actor. A lot of people want to believe the Feeding Our Future scandal happened because of a few bad organizations. That's comforting. It's simple. That allows us to pretend the system works and only individuals failed. But the indictments tell another story. Multiple nonprofits, multiple shell companies, dozens of participants, a web of overlapping fraud networks, coordinated money laundering, shared templates for fabricating documents, repeated exploitation of the same loopholes. This wasn't one bad actor. It was the marketplace reacting to a broken oversight structure. Criminals don't collaborate unless the opportunity is safe, unless the risk is low, unless the system is asleep. And Minnesota was asleep, but so were many others. When federal prosecutors called this brazen, they didn't mean reckless. They meant confident. Confident that nobody was checking. That confidence doesn't come from one state failure. It comes from national trends. Oversight didn't die in Minnesota. Oversight is dying everywhere, quietly, slowly, under the weight of bureaucracy, politics, and fear. Here's the part almost nobody connects. When public sector fraud becomes normalized, it stops being a financial issue and becomes a national security vulnerability. Because fraud networks learn how to exploit government systems. Criminal organizations gain political leverage through money. Foreign actors can launder influence through nonprofits. Corrupt networks can fund operations that destabilize communities. Public trust collapses, making citizens more polarized and easier to manipulate. When oversight dies, the vacuum attracts more than just petty criminals. It attracts everyone. This is why the FBI didn't treat Minnesota as a local scandal. They treated it as a federal threat vector. Not because Minnesota is uniquely dangerous, but because the system that allowed this to happen exists coast to coast. Every weak oversight program becomes a doorway. And doorways don't stay empty for long. If you're still with me and this breakdown is giving you clarity, hit like so more people see it, subscribe, and drop comment down below. What part of this failure surprised you the most? Engagement tells YouTube and these platforms that this long-form analysis matters. So the real question, who's minding the store? Minnesota answers that question with silence, and that silence is the entire problem. Fraud happens everywhere, but the difference between a functioning state and a failing one is how quickly they respond. Minnesota responded after the FBI raided more than a dozen locations, after banks filed suspicious activity reports, and prosecutors built cases. The state acted late, and only because federal law enforcement forced its hand. And here's the truth. If taxpayers waited for state officials to control this, they'd still be waiting. That's not a Minnesota problem. That's a blueprint of what happens when oversight dies. There's a moment in every failing system when the cracks stop being cracks and become something else entirely. A warning, a broadcast, a message written in numbers, indictments, and the quiet absences that where accountability used to live. That's where Minnesota is now. This isn't about scandal anymore. It's about the pattern, the consequences, the national implications of what happens when government grows confident while oversight grows quiet. Because fraud of this scale doesn't just steal money. It steals something far more irreplaceable: trust. And once trust breaks, everything downstream begins to fracture. Communities stop believing the system works. Taxpayers stop believing their money is protected. Citizens stop believing their leaders are competent. And government, instead of admitting failure, tries to outrun the consequences by changing the narrative rather than confronting the truth. Minnesota didn't just lose money, it lost credibility. And credibility is the oxygen of public institutions. Once it thins out, the whole structure starts gasping. The real cost isn't just financial. So let's cut a little bit deeper. You can quantify the dollars. Federal prosecutors allege over $250 million was funneled through fabricated invoices, shell nonprofits, and fake meal counts. You can count the indictments, more than 70 charged, dozens of guilty pleas already recorded. You can measure the scale, the largest COVID-related fraud case in U.S. history. But what's harder to measure and far more dangerous is the erosion of civic confidence. When people believe government, when they believe criminals can exploit the system faster than officials can investigate, when they believe oversight is optional instead of mandatory, something shifts. When people believe government cannot protect its own programs, when they believe criminals can exploit the system faster than officials can investigate, when they believe oversight is optional instead of mandatory, something shifts. The social contract weakens. Institutions lose moral authority. People begin to assume corruption is normal, expected, inevitable. That's the real danger. Because once corruption becomes expected, it stops being fought. Minnesota is a battleground, not because of the money stolen, but because of the mindset revealed. A mindset where leaders assumed compliance instead of verifying it, where agencies prioritized approvals over enforcement, where public funds moved faster than public scrutiny. And the result wasn't simply fraud. The result was predictable fraud, structural fraud, fraud that grew like an ecosystem because the soil was perfect for it. And ecosystems don't stay local. Minnesota is not an outlier. It's a case study, the first state where everything went wrong loud enough that the rest of the country was forced to look up. Because the same vulnerabilities exist everywhere. States that fast-tracked federal aid without expanding auditing capacity. Agencies that trusted documentation without verifying it. Programs where in-person inspections were paused for years. Nonprofits used as pass-through entities with little oversight. Local governments overwhelmed by the volume and velocity of applications. Fraud rings that communicate, share templates, and exploit identical loopholes. This isn't theory, it is documented. A 2023 report from the U.S. Pandemic Response Accountability Committee estimates between 100 to 300 billion in federal aid was stolen nationwide. The GAO warns that most improper payments remain uninvestigated. The FBI, DOJ, and OIG office across multiple agencies are still opening new cases, thousands of them. Minnesota is the headline, but the nation is the story. The question no one wants to ask: if Minnesota needed federal agents to clean up its disaster, if banks spotted red flags before state employees did, if nonprofits were approved without inspection, if millions were dispersed without verification, then what other states are living on borrowed time? Because the problem isn't how Minnesota failed. The problem is how easy it was for Minnesota to fail. Oversight wasn't defeated by sophistication. It was defeated by speed. Criminal networks moved faster than auditors. Applications moved faster than verification. Money moved faster than accountability. And when velocity outruns scrutiny, the system collapses. Minnesota isn't just the collapse. Minnesota is just where the collapse was televised. So what happens if nothing changes? If Minnesota becomes a footnote instead of a turning point, the consequences won't be subtle. Here's what follows when oversight dies. Number 1, fraud becomes embedded. Not temporary, not isolated, embedded. Criminal networks professionalize. They expand into other programs. They refine techniques. Number 2, public trust erodes. Every new scandal is judged through the lens of the last. Citizens disengage, polarization rises, governments lose legitimacy. 3, social services weaken. Money stolen is money unavailable for actual need. School lunches, housing assistance, healthcare support. The poor pay the highest price for other people's criminal profit. Number 4, federal intervention increases. When states fail oversight, Washington steps in. More investigations, more compliance mandates, more federal pressure. States lose autonomy because they failed responsibility. Number 5, political actors weaponize the scandal. Not to fix it, but to exploit it. Fraud becomes ammunition, not urgency. And while they argue, the system decays further. So the part that no one wants to discuss, this is a leadership failure. Fraud on this scale never happens without enabling conditions. Leaders who assume compliance, managers who avoid confrontation, agencies afraid of political backlash, systems built on trust instead of proof. Minnesota didn't miss the fraud. Minnesota allowed the conditions for the fraud. And so does every state that prioritizes velocity over verification. The scandal isn't a glitch. It's a blueprint, a demonstration of how vulnerable the United States becomes when accountability is replaced by urgency. Governments collapse quietly before they collapse loudly. Governments collapse quietly before they collapse loudly. Minnesota collapsed quietly for years. The part is what we're watching right now. So I'm going to leave you with a final warning. Minnesota is the future unless something changes. If nothing is rebuilt, if nothing is corrected, if no structural changes are made, Minnesota will not be a scandal. It will be a preview, a trailer, a warning label, a map of where the cracks run beneath the surface of American governance. Because oversight is not a suggestion. Oversight is the guardian of every democracy. And when the guardian falls asleep, the wolves don't wait. They walk right through the door. If this long-form breakdown opened your eyes, hit like so YouTube knows this analysis matters, and subscribe so you don't miss further breakdowns. And then please drop a comment. Do you think Minnesota is the warning sign or the blueprint? Your engagement determines whether this message gets buried or amplified. If you want rapid-fire geopolitical, economic, and corruption updates in real time, follow me on TikTok, The Watchman 98. Daily intel, no fluff, no filler. Listen to my podcast, The Watchman 98, over on Spotify. That's where I put full-length breakdowns, mindset frameworks, etc. And as always, stay sharp, stay aware, and continue to stand watch.